Pedro Casas, thank you for speaking to Mexico News Daily.
My pleasure.
So we've just heard you now in conversation with MND's Travis Bembernek, and you said that you anticipate or you see a very bright future for Mexico, in part because you believe that Mexico will avoid the tariffs on its exports to the US, and it could become more competitive if there are tariffs on China. Can you elaborate a little bit on that optimism?
Right, absolutely. So everything narrows down to a fact that the economic relationship between the US and Mexico has evolved in the past 3 decades of being trading partners to being part of a co-production system. US trading partners are China, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and some other countries, in which the way you can balance out some of the issues that President Trump has in mind, trade deficits and so on, could be solved through tariffs. But the relationship with Mexico is now a one that is so integrated that tariffs are no longer an option. If you put tariffs on Mexican exports, you are, statistically speaking and literally speaking, also imposing tariffs on yourself, when putting yourself in the United States, right? Because the value add of US in Mexican exports is quite high. It's the biggest country in which we are adding up value to things that are being also produced in the US. At the same time, when you analyze the amount of exports from US companies to the United States, where you can make the argument that many of those profits are actually being sent back to the US as well, is also quite large. Last year, we had a trade surplus from Mexico to the US of $150 billion, or in other ways, the US has a trade deficit of 150 billion with Mexico. But American companies from Mexico exporting to the US manufactured goods is around 170 billion. So it's a little bit tricky arithmetically speaking, and it's not, if there's our economist listening to us, they'll say that's not the way you should calculate it. I know, but just to put it very simplistically, if you do that math, then there wouldn't be any trade deficit at all. It's more complex, but just to give you a very simplistic overview of why I believe Mexico will be just fine in the next few days or even decades.
I'm sure the federal government shares your optimism, or I think they do. Last month, they came out with a new economic plan that's very broad and very ambitious.
Yeah.
I don't want to speak about it too broadly, but just could you give us your impressions on some of its goals to become the 10th largest economy in the world? I think 1.5 million jobs, and also aiming to reduce reliance on imports from China and other Asian countries. Could you just give us a quick impression on the plan?
Right. So it's an ambitious plan. As you just mentioned, they're planning on generating a substantial amount of jobs, bringing in a lot of foreign direct investments, and so on. Those things are great, kind of the objectives. Now, we could all talk about promises and objectives, and that is debatable, whatever. But the important thing is the second part of our plan, which is how are we going to get there? And there are several things that are important. One is a huge investment in infrastructure, which we've always said that is a huge and important part of Mexico's potential growth. If we focus solely on the trade relationship with the US, we can see that in the past 30 years, trade between our nations have grown on a 10x amount, right? Nonetheless, our infrastructure hasn't, not any close to that number. So if the flow of goods has increased in that amount, and the arteries through from where that goods are being transported hasn't, then we got a big issue. So Plan Mexico, investment in railways, investment in highways, airports, ports, border infrastructure, amazing. Just what we need. Also, there's an important plan on investing in energy. trying to find a sweet spot between keeping the public sector as the predominant player in oil in energy production, but having 45% of the private sector as part of the deal as well. I think that is good news compared to where we were in the past 6 years. And I could go on and on with some other issues, but kind of the key ingredient there is that the private sector is being a central part in the discussion. It's been a central part in understanding the future of those plans and understanding that we have to be and we will be a key central player in the implementation of all of that. So for us, is good news overall. We see with good eyes that we have a plan and we now understand how where to move from now on. So
And another aspect of the plan is cutting red tape for businesses and the digitalization of trámites, of bureaucratic procedures. How will that benefit the companies you represent at AMCHAM, and will that help to attract more investment in your view, or at least speed it up?
absolutely. Absolutely. That is something we've been pushing very hard since ages. Because when you compare what it takes in Mexico to make an investment possible, to have access to a permit, to whatever type of regulation, compared to not even Europe or the US, but to Latin America, is substantially slower, and it's a lot of red tape to make that possible. So Claudia Sheinbaum is pushing forward a plan. They're creating an agency that is called the Digital Aid Agency for Telecommunications and something else, which their objective is to reduce the red tape and the time for you to make any type of government bureaucratic procedure by half. That is a big changer for the country, for sure.
I think the last time I spoke to you was when you were at Semicon West at the conference in San Francisco last year. Can you give us a little bit of an update on what's happening in the Mexican semiconductor sector?
Yeah. So overall, a huge milestone in the Mexican semiconductor arena is that for the first time in ages, we've seen a coordinated effort to have every single player in the industry aligned in several objectives. And I'm talking about the Mexican government at the federal and the state level and local level, having universities reaching into the equation, the private sector, from within the private sector, many different players, consumers, because within the semiconductor industry, you have the players that actually buy the semiconductors, let's say Apple, but you also have the producers, which are Intel and Nvidia and some other players. We have the US government within that equation as well. We've been celebrating several forums to work on the master plan, the semiconductor master plan. And so it's just that the what we've accomplished from that was probably 8 months ago, something like that, up until today. It's exactly that, aligning every single player into key objectives. And now we just recently saw a few days ago President Sheinbaum also kind of saying this is the way forward. Even at the presidential level, we agree with what is being told and said, and we're going to be working on facilitating and incentivizing and giving tax breaks and whatever it's needed to make this happen. So having everyone aligned, huge milestone.
And so you said earlier in your conversation with Travis, chips or semiconductors are like the oil of today. For our readers, could you explain that a little bit? Why?
Exactly. So everything that gets the world moving has a semiconductor in it. The cameras that we're using right now to videotape us having a conversation, our cell phones, our laptops, our cars, every machine that it's used to produce any good that you can potentially imagine has a semiconductor in it. For the future, when we're talking about Internet of Things, AI, and everything that is going to drive economic growth and development in the world is based on semiconductors. And so, as I was saying, this is an economic issue that is super important, but at the same time, it has a factor of national security in it. Because if there's a single player or a very few players that actually are the ones that are producing the oil of today, that gives them a lot of leverage and power to turn off or on the economy of the world. And so that is a huge bet on the American government and private sector to move that industry into US or North America's territory. Same as with Mexico, huge opportunity that we need to seize.
Finally, next year, the USMCA reviews coming up. What do you anticipate from that? Do you think there will be any major change or renegotiation, as Trump I'd like to put it?
Yeah. So I think that Donald Trump's conception of trade is different from what we've been accustomed for the past 30 years of free trade and globalization. I think that Donald Trump believes that the US has been tricked by many players around the world, players understanding countries and economies. Uh, Everyone in the world has higher levels of tariffs um, than the US and many other preconceptions that Donald Trump has. So he's going to be investing a lot of time and effort to, in his mind, level up the playing field for the US and everyone else. That might put some challenges into the USMCA review, might be pushing for Mexico and Canada to align themselves even more to the United States needs than to the rest of the world. Let don't forget that Mexico is one, if not the most open economy in the world in terms of free trade agreements with dozens of countries around the world. Um, so the United States might be pushing for Mexico to be closer together to them. Uh, but we'll see. It will definitely be a hard time for the negotiator or a part of the review process. We'll have to wait and see.
Thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.